Hey everybody, Dr. O here. Welcome to the brain and cranial nerve review. So a couple of really important features here, so it's going to take a little while, and then some quicker ones as well. So all right, let's jump right in. What are the key features of each area of the brain? Well, I could teach a course on that. So I like to start at the bottom of the brainstem and work up, and then I'll just kind of give you the one or two, possibly three key things that are happening in each part of the brain. Obviously, you should be using all your other resources as well. So the brainstem is made up of the mesencephalon or midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata is on the bottom. What I like to say about the brain just in general, the higher up something is in the brain, the more important it is for being human. You know, these higher level things. The lower something is in the brain, the more important it is for survival, which is why they call our brainstem our reptilian brain or lizard brain, because these same functions are all needed in animals that aren't as complex as us. So the medulla oblongata, I think, basic life support. It's as low down as you can go in the brain. So this is going to be where your cardiovascular centers are, specifically the cardiac centers that control the heart, the vasomotor centers that control your blood vessels. We also have digestive centers are going to be here, and so are the respiratory rhythmicity centers, and that's a key word there because you'll see that there's other respiratory centers later. Respiratory rhythmicity centers that basically say breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. So basic life support, think the medulla oblongata. The pons is where our respiratory rate centers are. So the pons receives information primarily about carbon dioxide levels and determines if we need to be breathing faster or slower based on the information. So just as a hint, and we'll cover this in later chapters, if there's too much carbon dioxide, your respiratory rate is going to go up, so you blow it off. Too little, your respiratory rate will go down, so you keep it. All right, so the respiratory rate centers are in the pons. The other key thing with the pons is this is what connects your cerebellum to the rest of your brain and spinal cord. So it's a connection point. Next, we have the mesencephalon, which actually means middle of the brain. So midbrain is probably the term you're going to hear more often now. The key things here are going to be visual and auditory reflexes. So you don't see and hear here, but let's say something catches my eye and I track it. So the tracking that comes with catching things out of the corner of your eye. Auditory reflexes, if I hear a loud noise, I'm either going to look towards it or I'm going to protect myself. So those are what I mean by visual and auditory reflexes. Especially if you're not really focused on what you're looking at, those things can catch your attention, like, oh, a squirrel, right? Can catch your attention pretty easily. So visual and auditory reflexes come from the mesencephalon. The other big thing here is the maintenance of consciousness. And that's a word that I need to clarify because conscious and consciousness basically mean two things when we talk about the brain. So in this case, we're talking about the fact that you're not asleep. So consciousness means you're awake and you're alert. The word conscious or being conscious of something means that you are focused on it and aware of it. Because much of what occurs in the brain, the huge majority, is subconscious. So it's happening underneath your consciousness or your conscious control. All right, so quickly review because those are key areas. Medulla oblongata, think basic life support. Cardiovascular centers, digestive centers, respiratory rhythmicity centers. Pons, respiratory rate centers, as well as the connection between the cerebellum and the rest of your nervous system. And the mesencephalon or midbrain, visual and auditory reflexes, and the maintenance of a conscious alert state. It's a more specific piece of the mesencephalon called the reticular formation, but that's not a huge deal. All right, so above the brainstem, we have the diencephalon. So the diencephalon has three parts. It's going to be the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus, which means kind of above and around. Let's start there because it's the most minor one, at least for now. The epithalamus is where the pineal or pineal gland is. So when we cover the endocrine system, you'll see that that's the gland that produces melatonin. So when it's dark out, it produces melatonin. When it's light out, it produces less or none. So that's the epithalamus. The thalamus and the hypothalamus are much more important. So thalamus, I want you thinking two key things here. Number one is it's a filter. So the thalamus, imagine it being a switchboard operator or something that filters information. What do I absolutely have to be aware of versus what am I being exposed to? So 99% or more of what is being sent towards your brain right now is going to be filtered out by the thalamus. The thalamus determines what does Frank's or what does your consciousness need to be aware of. So I don't know if you're big into like superheroes, but like Superman, the Man of Steel movie, I remember when he was a kid, he had a lot of trouble because he could literally hear everything, and it was driving him mad. If you could see and hear everything that you're exposed to, your brain would fry, your servers would overload. So the thalamus has to say, what do I need to be aware of? So let me give you an example. My wedding ring. So the wedding ring is very, very most important physical object in my life, but I have to feel to see if it's there because I'm no longer aware of it. When I first started wearing it, it was almost annoying how that's all I could think about. But my brain realized, okay, it's there, it's not a threat, we don't have to worry about it, so let's filter out that information. I can't feel the socks on my feet right now. Kind of the same thing there. The only sensation that can't be filtered out by the thalamus is actually smell. So you can get used to smells. That's something called adaptation we covered in a different review. But you can't not smell something, at least early on. All right, so that's your thalamus. The filter mechanism is really important. So it determines what reaches your consciousness, what reaches your cerebrum. But the other big thing is it does play a role in mental state, emotion, emotion and memory, and probably how those two things are connected, because the thalamus is part of something called the limbic system that we'll cover later. All right. The last part of, I have done whole videos on it, but the last part of your diencephalon is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is super important, but in a word, it helps you maintain homeostasis. So hopefully that's a term you're pretty familiar with, being in anatomy courses. The maintenance of a stable internal environment. So what I like to say is your hypothalamus doesn't do anything, it makes you want to do things. This is going to be where your urges and drives come from. So thirst centers, hunger centers, sexual pursuit area of the brain, these kind of things. The hypothalamus wants you to seek pleasure and avoid pain, and that's its job. It makes things that it wants you to do rewarding. So the reward centers we always talk about when it comes to drugs and addiction and cigarettes or whatever, sugar, are in this part of the brain as well. So the hypothalamus has these, is where your urges and drives come from. What I like to say is think about willpower. Right? Everyone knows what willpower is. We've used it or tried to use it, right? Willpower is what your hypothalamus is fighting, right? So your hypothalamus tells you, I want to smoke a cigarette. Your willpower says, I don't want to smoke a cigarette. Your conscious mind is saying, I know a cigarette's a bad idea. The battle is being waged between those two areas. So that's the first thing I think about with the hypothalamus, is it's where these urges come from to do things. So it's not making you do things, but it's making you want to do them. Let's put it that way. It does so many other things, though. The hypothalamus, there's really 8 main functions, but so those urges and drives are there. It helps control your core body temperature. This is where things like your adipostat are that play a role in maintaining appropriate body fat levels, etc. It does produce some hormones. We'll cover that in the endocrine system, but it actually makes the regulatory hormones that control the pituitary gland. It also makes 2 hormones, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, but not a big deal at this point. Though I think those are all the main things that are going on there in the hypothalamus. So that's really the most complex part of the diencephalon. So to review, above the brainstem, you have the 3 parts of the diencephalon: epithalamus, pineal gland, production of melatonin. Thalamus, think of it as a filter and playing a role like in your emotions and behavior. And the hypothalamus helps you maintain homeostasis. All right, so above the diencephalon, we now have the cerebrum. So the key word with the cerebrum is conscious. This is where the things that you're aware of are going to be happening. So everything that's happening below, so in the hypothalamus, these are subconscious. They're not under your direct voluntary control. The cerebrum is where we perceive things, where we are aware of them, and where we make decisions. So think that word conscious being the key there. The next thing I would think about with the cerebrum is what are called higher order functions: memory, planning, these types of things. The fact that we recognize things as beautiful, where our logic and creativity, these are all the things that happen in the cerebrum. Obviously, I can't tell everything about the brain in just a few minutes, but those are the key features of the cerebrum, and then the diencephalon and the brainstem. Last area is the cerebellum. So we said the cerebellum was connected to the pons, and that's how it travels or sends information and receives information. Excuse me. Cerebellum, think 3 words: balance, posture, coordination. So the cerebellum doesn't make you do anything either, but what you do, it makes it more smooth. When we talk about muscle memory, when we talk about, getting better with practice, it's because the cerebellum relies on trial and error. When you first started to walk, you toddled. That's why they called you a toddler. And now hopefully you can walk much better than that because of practice. You learned how to ride a bike. You learned how to write. You've learned how to use instruments, whatever it is. That practice, that muscle memory we talk about is not in your muscles. Muscle memory is, most of it's in your cerebellum there. Okay, so those are the key features of each area of the brain. We'll talk about the lobes of the cerebrum in just a moment. You can get a drink here. How many ventricles are in your brain and what is in them? So you have 4 ventricles. You have your 2 lateral ventricles, the 3rd ventricle, and the 4th ventricle. I can't show it to you here, but it kind of looks like a weird alien creature. What's in it is cerebrospinal fluid. So the ventricles and then the covering of your brain and spinal cord and the central canal running down your spinal cord are going to be where cerebrospinal fluid is. It plays a role in moving some materials. It also plays a role in cushioning, but you don't have to know a lot about that, so I'll save some time here. All right, same with the next area. Know the 3 layers of the cranial meninges. So whether it's cranial or spinal meninges is just a matter of location. The outside, the outer layer, the thick, toughest outermost layer is called the dura mater. In the middle you have the arachnoid mater because it looks like a spider web, arachnoid mater, and then the delicate thin layer on the inside is called the pia mater. So let's connect these two. So the ventricles, cerebrospinal fluid, and your meninges. What do they do? So what protects your brain? What I think of is this, right? Your skull, your cranium protects your brain from the outside world. So if I bump my head, hopefully I don't have a major brain trauma. Well, what protects your brain, this delicate structure inside your cranium, from your skull? What protects your brain from these bones? Well, that's going to be the meninges that help to stabilize, and the cerebrospinal fluid that lubricates as well. So that's how I like to look at it. Your cranium, your bones protect your brain from the outside world. Cerebrospinal fluid and your meninges protect it from your brain, or from your skull. All right, just some basic terms as far as the cerebrum goes, or the brain in general. What is a gyrus, a sulcus, and a fissure? So your brain has a lot of hills and it has a lot of valleys. So a sulcus is going to be one of the valleys, one of the indentations in the surface of your brain. The gyrus is going to be the hills. So the elevations in your brain are called a gyrus. The dips are called a sulcus. And the reason we have those is because it greatly increases the surface area of the brain. Look at someone like Einstein. His brain didn't look an awful lot different than ours, but they do think he had a little more surface area. And there actually are some genetic diseases where people's brains are smooth. They don't have that massive increase in surface area, which means they can't have as much gray matter as everyone else. And there's usually profound mental problems that come with that. So a gyrus, think a hill. A sulcus, think a valley. A fissure is a deep groove. The only one that you're going to have to worry about in my class is the longitudinal fissure. So there's a deep groove that separates the left and right cerebral hemispheres. So gyrus is a hill, sulcus is a valley, a fissure is a deep groove, and that longitudinal fissure in the middle is the key one. All right, now we're going to talk about the different lobes of the brain and what they do. So there's 2 very specific places you have to know, which are in the next point, and then we'll just talk about the general lobes in the point after that. So what is in the pre-central gyrus of the frontal lobe, and then what is in the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe? So your pre-central gyrus of your frontal lobe is where your primary motor cortex is. So there's a premotor cortex, there's other motor areas in your frontal lobe, but this is the primary motor cortex that tells my hand to move this finger, not this thumb, right, or this finger. So the pre-central gyrus of the frontal lobe is your primary motor cortex. What's in the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe? That's going to be your primary sensory cortex, where you're feeling, where you're perceiving sensations. So the central sulcus, that little hill between the two, that's why that's important, because in front of it we have the pre-central gyrus. Behind it we have the post-central gyrus. Just remember, primary motor cortex, primary sensory cortex. All right, which lobe of the brain houses vision, which is sight, olfaction, which is smell, that should be gustation, not gustatation, sorry, gustation, which is taste, and hearing, which is hearing. So, all right, so let's just go through all of them. So the frontal lobe, I generally do think motor, but then also the prefrontal cortex is what makes us human. This is where planning, I like to say that what we do different than most animal species is we can predict the future. Not because we're psychic, but because we can understand the outcomes of our actions, the potential outcomes of our actions. So we can plan, we can predict the future in a sense. That happens in the frontal lobe. But for motor is fine for just the basic functions. The parietal lobe, think sensation. So that's going to be under the parietal bones here. In the back, the occipital lobe is going to be vision. So your visual centers are in the occipital lobe. Then we have the temporal lobe is going to be the only one with 2 major functions, and that's going to be hearing and smell are both going to take place in the temporal lobe. And then if you were to peel apart the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobe, there's going to be an extra lobe called the insula or insular lobe. Insula means island, so it's kind of off on its own and hidden a little bit. That's going to be where your gustatory cortex or taste takes place. So to answer these questions in order, vision would be the occipital lobe, olfaction would be the temporal lobe on the side, gustation, sorry, not gustatation, gustation would be the insular lobe, hearing would again be the temporal lobe. All right, key functions of the hypothalamus, I actually already went through them, but the maintenance of your core body temperature, maintenance of homeostasis in general, those urge centers and drive centers, things like hunger and thirst, the fact that it produces the hormones that control the pituitary gland, produces some other hormones. In the endocrine system, we'll call this the bridge between your nervous and endocrine systems. So those should be all the key ones. All right, know all 12 pairs of cranial nerves, number, name, and the function I gave you in lecture. So number one, know the number with Roman numerals. It's important. So if you don't know your Roman numerals, make sure you know at least 1 through 12, because when cranial nerves are talked about, they almost all, I actually never seen really where they don't use Roman numerals. So you're like cranial nerve 3, you have to know is an I. So know the number, the name, and the function, main function. Real broad major functions. So first, what are some ways to remember them in order? There's mnemonic devices. So I use one that I learned. You know, there are some other dirty ones and stuff like that, but that's not the kind of stuff I teach you guys. So on old Olympus, tiny tops, a freeloading, vagrant German viewed a hop. Doesn't mean anything, but I remember that sentence, and the first letter of every word in that sentence is the first letter of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So whatever works for you. I have one here that I found actually in a textbook, so it's probably a little more fitting. So O, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are heavenly. That's actually a pretty good one. So O, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are heavenly. So whatever works for you. If you make your own up, it probably would be the best, but no need. All right, so, excuse me. Cranial nerve 1, the olfactory nerve, olfaction, smell. Pretty straightforward. Cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve. That's going to be vision. So your retinal cells send signals through the optic nerve, and that's how we see. So 1, olfaction, smell. 2, optic, vision. Cranial nerve 3, oculomotor. So oculo means eye, motor. So this is going to control all of the intrinsic eye muscles. Intrinsic meaning muscles on the inside of the eye. So you might think, do I have muscles in my eye? Well, you do. There are muscles that control your pupil, they control, I was going to say diameter, that control the diameter of your pupil. So when your iris gets bigger or smaller, that changes the size of the opening. So there are muscles that control how big your pupil is. If I turn these lights off, my pupils would get bigger. If I turned more lights on, my pupils would get smaller. We also have muscles that control the shape of your lens. So the lens has to change shape. For me to look at this screen or look off a mile in the distance, my lens needs to be a different shape. So those are the intrinsic eye muscles. They control the diameter of your pupil and the shape of your lens. The oculomotor nerve also controls 4 of your 6 extrinsic eye muscles. And I never ask you to know exactly what each one does, but just know that there are 6 muscles that control the outside of my eye. So if I have you follow my finger and you track my finger, I'd have you look in all the cardinal fields of view to make sure that your eye muscles all work and your eyes move together in all the appropriate directions. So just know 4 of the 6 extrinsic eye muscles are going to be controlled by the oculomotor nerve. Next, cranial nerve 4, we have trochlear. Trochlea means pulley. It actually has to do with the pulley-like shape of the one muscle it controls. So the trochlear nerve controls 1 of your 6 extrinsic eye muscles. It's called the superior oblique, but you don't have to know that. Just know, I'll generally just ask you what 3 cranial nerves control these extrinsic eye muscles. So it would be 3, 4, and 6. So that's 4, the trochlear nerve. 5 is trigeminal. So tri means 3. It actually has to do with the fact that there are 3 branches. So this is the nerve that controls sensation to your face. So if you were testing it, you'd want to make sure that people could feel in all 3 of these areas of the face. So trigeminal is sensation to the face, and it is motor to the muscles of mastication. So mastication is chewing. So when you're chewing your food, it is your trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5. Next we have abducens, the cranial nerve 6. Abduction, it controls the lateral rectus muscle on the outside of my eye that abducts it. Abduction is taking it away from the midline. So the abducens nerve controls that 6th. Extrinsic eye muscles. So to review, 3, 4, and 6 control the extrinsic eye muscles. 3 also controls all of the intrinsic eye muscles. Cranial nerve 7, your facial nerve. This is going to be sensation is just the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So it actually takes 2 cranial nerves for sensation to the tongue. So the anterior 2/3 of the tongue is going to be the facial nerve. The key thing with the facial nerve is it's motor. It controls the muscles of facial expression. So smiling, frowning, raising my eyelids or eyebrows and eyelids. These are going to be controlled by cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve. Cranial nerve 8, vestibulocochlear. So once you know your special senses, you'll know the vestibule and the cochlea. The vestibule is the part of the inner ear involved in equilibrium, balance, and movement, these types of things. So the vestibular portion of the vestibulocochlear nerve, think equilibrium and balance. Cochlear, the cochlea is where we hear, so hearing. So balance and hearing are the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 8. All right, cranial nerve 9, we have glossopharyngeal. Glosso means tongue. Pharynx is your throat. So think about the muscles of the throat primarily involved with swallowing. So there's a lot of overlap here with swallowing, but when I'm asking you about swallowing and throat muscles, it is the glossopharyngeal nerve, but it is also sensation to the posterior third of the tongue. So cranial nerves 7 and 8 work together for the sensation to your tongue. All right, cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve. Vagus means wanderer because this nerve has a massive reach throughout your body. Most cranial nerves stay right in very specific areas. So it's a huge function. So sensory and motor to almost all organs of the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity. Until we get down to like the reproductive organs and the real distal intestines, the vagus nerve controls pretty much everything. So think heart, lungs, stomach, pancreas, all those things. So the vagus nerve, sensation and motor to most organs of the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity. Cranial nerve 11 is the accessory nerve. You may also hear it called the spinal accessory nerve, but not much anymore. The accessory nerve helps control 2 of your actual spinal skeletal muscles, and that's going to be the sternocleidomastoid muscles right here and your trapezius. So just it helps your spinal nerves control those 2 muscles. This could be why someone is paralyzed but still has a little bit of motor function in these areas. And the last one, cranial nerve 12, hypoglossal. So glossal means tongue. This is the muscle that controls the muscle, or the nerve that controls the muscles to your tongue. So when you stick your tongue out of your mouth, it's the hypoglossal nerve that allows it to happen. All right, so just real quickly, 1, olfactory, smell, 2, optic, vision, 3, oculomotor, the intrinsic eye muscles, and 4 of the 6 extrinsic eye muscles. 4, trochlear, 1 of the 6 extrinsic eye muscles. 5, trigeminal, sensation to the face, motor to muscles of mastication. 6, the abducens nerve, that 6th extrinsic eye muscle. 7, your facial nerve, sensation to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, motor to the muscles of facial expression. 8, vestibulocochlear, so vestibular, think balance, cochlear, think hearing. 9, glossopharyngeal, that's going to be a sensation to the posterior third of the tongue, so 7 and 9 work together to control the tongue. And then the muscles of swallowing, the muscles of the throat. 10, vagus nerve, sensory and motor control to the organs of the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity, almost all of them. 11, the accessory nerve that helps control the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles. And the hypoglossal nerve controls the tongue. So, all right, that's obviously a huge part. What is the limbic system? What are its main functions, and what role does the hippocampus play? The limbic system is really, it's a major player when it comes to emotions. You know, fear and anger we think of a lot, but a lot of emotions are seated here. But the main thing to me is that it plays a big role in linking your consciousness and your subconsciousness. So again, when you're afraid, you will do things that your limbic system wants you to do, but it's not really making you do it. It's urging you to do it. It's making it seem like the right thing to do, these kind of things, right? But so generally when I think emotion and linking conscious and subconscious activities, that's what I think of with the limbic system. It's actually not a location. It's a region of the brain with multiple pieces in it, like the cingulate gyrus, the hippocampus we're going to talk about here, parts of the thalamus. So it's a functional area, not a structural one. Not a huge deal. All right, what role does the hippocampus play? There's a reason I specifically mention this part. It plays a role in memory. So as a student, you have to learn a lot. Memory consolidation. It's what turns your short-term memories into like medium and long-term concrete memories. All right, last point here. What is hemispheric lateralization? So it's a fancy way of saying the left side and right side of my brain look the same, but different things happen. You've all heard, and you can't look at it and say, okay, well, that's where language must occur, and this is where creativity comes from. It doesn't work that way. So because of this, the fact that the two halves of the brain look the same but have different functions. This is where you get the whole, are you right side or right brain or left brain type person? Where does logical thinking occur? Kind of like a robot. Where does your real creative, artistic thinking occur? I think there's overlap. I think people can obviously be some of both. Whenever I've taken any of those tests, I'm pretty much right down the middle. But that's what the term means, just so you're not confused by it. Okay, a lot of important stuff here. Obviously, the brain and your cranial nerves are important, so I truly hope this helps you. Let me know if there's anything I can do for you, and have a wonderful day. Be blessed.